The following Friday, the county inspector arrived with 2 deputies from code enforcement and a stack of documents thicker than Daniel's sense of entitlement. I stood in my driveway while they walked through my garage, photographed the unauthorized commercial inventory, logged the hazardous storage violations, and posted a cease and desist notice on the very side door my son had once told his employees was basically company property. It wasn't. It never had been. By noon, his online fulfillment operation was shut down pending penalties, his business license suspended over false registration disclosures, and every supplier who had been shipping to my home received notice that the address had been removed from his records. Daniel kept saying there had to be some misunderstanding, but misunderstandings don't come with forged occupancy declarations and unpaid commercial taxes. Those come with consequences. What stunned him most was not the fines, though they were steep enough to force him to liquidate inventory. It was the second envelope I handed him. Inside was a lease agreement he had laughed off months earlier when I first suggested putting our arrangement in writing. My attorney had reconstructed years of unpaid commercial use based on square footage, storage duration, utilities, and liability exposure. The total amount he owed me was more money than he had ever admitted making from that business. For the first time in his life, my son realized kindness had never meant permission. He tried to appeal to sentiment. Said I was humiliating him. Said family shouldn't do this to family. I looked him in the eye and told him family shouldn't build an empire inside a widow's garage and call it love. News spread faster than he expected. In a town like ours, people notice when code enforcement trucks sit outside a suburban home all morning. His reputation took a harder hit than the penalties. Vendors backed out. Clients asked questions. Even his wife, who had pushed him to keep using mom's place until she notices, went pale when she understood there would be no bluffing this away. They had mistaken my patience for weakness. That was their fatal math. 2 weeks later, I had the garage restored. His pallets were gone. The oil stains were cleaned. My late husband's old red tool chest stood where it had always belonged. I rehung his fishing rods on the back wall, put his radio back on the shelf. On a quiet Monday morning, I raised the garage door and sunlight hit the concrete just the way it used to when my husband was alive. It felt less like reclaiming a room and more like taking back my own name. Daniel came by once after that, asking if we could start over. I told him we already had. The difference was this time he would meet me as a son, not an occupier. He nodded, but he knew the terms had changed forever. The garage was mine. The deed was secure. The locks were mine. The boundary was mine. And the woman he thought would keep absorbing disrespect had vanished the moment I turned that key. People sometimes ask if I regret going that far. I tell them no. I regret not doing it sooner. Because the day I changed those locks, I didn't just shut my son out of a building. I shut exploitation out of my life. He lost a business built on borrowed ground. I regained a home built on dignity. And in the end, that was the only balance sheet that mattered. My son used my garage for his business. On Monday, I changed the locks. Daniel still thinks the story began with a key, but it started long before that. The first afternoon he stood in my kitchen holding a cardboard box of shipping labels and said he only needed a little space for a couple weeks. I remember the way sunlight fell through the window over the sink, catching dust motes in the air while coffee brewed, and the old wall clock ticked louder than usual. My husband had been gone 3 years by then, and the garage still smelled faintly of motor oil, cedar shelves, and the tobacco pipe he used to keep hidden in a drawer. It was never just a garage to me. It was memory with a roll-up door. But Daniel smiled the way he used to as a boy when he wanted a favor, and I said yes. A folding table became a workstation. A few boxes became rows of inventory. Then one morning I woke to hear the side gate slam before 8 o'clock and saw 2 strangers unloading cartons by the garage. Employees, Daniel said later, as if that explained why people I didn't know were walking across my property carrying dollies. I said nothing then. Mothers excuse things they shouldn't. That summer, vans started coming 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes before breakfast. Sometimes after dark. I would hear the garage door grinding open while I sat in my robe at the kitchen table paying electric bills. My house had rhythms once. Birds at dawn. Church bells on Sunday. My husband humming over a carburetor. Now there were barcode scanners beeping through the walls. One Tuesday, I stepped into the garage looking for a box of Christmas ornaments and found the old red tool chest shoved into a corner under packing tape and printer paper. My husband's fishing rods were gone from the wall. In their place were shelves of merchandise wrapped in plastic. I touched the workbench where we had once painted birdhouses with our grandson and realized I was standing in a room I recognized but no longer owned in spirit. "It's temporary," Daniel kept saying. But temporary things do not install industrial shelving. Temporary things do not duplicate keys. I knew something shifted the day I heard him on the phone telling a supplier, "Ship it to our warehouse." Our warehouse. I stood in the laundry room just beyond the door, holding a basket of towels, and those two words landed colder than winter rain. Not Mom's garage. Not the family property. His warehouse. That was when I began noticing what I had ignored. The utility bill climbing. Delivery trucks rutting the driveway. A neighbor asking whether I had rented out the detached building. Shame has a quiet sound. It sounds like pretending not to mind. I told myself Daniel was ambitious, that helping him was what mothers did. But late one evening, after his workers left, I walked through the garage alone and found a clipboard hanging by the side door. At the top was a typed emergency contact form. Under facility address was my home. Under owner authorization was a signature that was not mine. I stared at it so long my tea went cold in my hand, and for the first time I did not feel merely used. I felt occupied. I did not confront him that night. I did something far more dangerous. I began paying attention. The next morning I made pancakes I did not want and let them grow cold while I reread that emergency contact form at the kitchen table. There is a moment when suspicion turns into recognition, and once it does, ordinary things begin to look altered. The driveway looked longer. The house quieter. Even Daniel's cheerful text seemed rehearsed. Around noon, I pulled the folder where I kept property records from the hall cabinet, the same oak cabinet my husband had built with dovetail joints, so precise he used to joke they would outlive all of us. I had not touched those papers in years. Date. Insurance policy. Tax assessment. I spread them across the dining room table and read every page slowly. It was not fear moving through me then. It was something colder. Precision. 2 days later, a white delivery truck backed halfway across my lawn to unload industrial shelving. No one had asked permission. I stepped outside, and the driver called me ma'am without looking up, as if I were a neighbor passing by instead of the homeowner. Inside the garage, I found Daniel measuring wall space with a laser level. He smiled when he saw me. Said growth had been better than expected. Said he might need to convert part of the side storage room too. Might need. As though these decisions floated above ownership. I asked him whether his business was registered somewhere else. He paused too long before answering. That pause stayed with me. That evening I called my insurance agent under the pretense of updating records. I described commercial inventory stored on residential property and asked casual questions I did not feel casual asking. There was a silence on the other end before she said, "Mrs. Whitmore, if there is employee activity or commercial shipping there, your personal coverage may be exposed." Exposed. I wrote the word down and stared at it after hanging up. I barely slept. At 3 a.m, I walked into the garage in slippers and stood among stacked cartons labeled for products I had never heard of. Portable humidifié. Fitness bands. Electronic adapters. A business had grown inside my grief while I was trying to be generous. My flashlight swept across a clipboard mounted by the side door, and this time I noticed a laminated fire exit plan with the words facility supervisor above Daniel's name. It was no longer borrowing. It was occupation with paperwork. On Friday I drove to City Hall, parked beneath a sycamore tree shedding bark in strips, and asked a zoning clerk whether a detached residential garage could be used as a fulfillment center. She adjusted her glasses and asked for the property address. Her eyebrows lifted when she checked the parcel file. Then she asked whether I had applied for commercial occupancy. I said no. She slid a pamphlet toward me and spoke softly, almost kindly. Someone could be putting you at serious liability risk. When I came home, Daniel was in the driveway laughing with 2 men loading inventory. He waved like nothing in the world was wrong. I waved back. That was the strange part. I did not confront him. I began collecting facts. Dates. Utility spikes. Delivery invoices left by mistake. I even found a vendor bill using my address beneath a company name I had never been told existed. Whitmore Distribution Services. Not Daniel's side hustle. A corporation. Registered while he was drinking coffee in my kitchen every Sunday. By then, something inside me had gone very still. I was no longer asking whether my son was crossing boundaries. I was asking how far. And once a mother starts asking that question, she is already preparing for the answer. By the following week, I knew enough to understand Daniel had built more than a side business. What I did not yet know was how deeply he had tied my home to it. That answer arrived in the smallest way, the way dangerous truths often do. A cream-colored envelope had slipped beneath the garage side door, wedged against a stack of shipping cartons. It looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Vendor statement, I assumed. I nearly tossed it onto Daniel's work table unopened. But my name was printed under the property address and below it, in smaller letters, premises guarantor. I read those too. Words 3 times before their meaning settled in my chest. Guarantor. I took the envelope into the house and sat where my husband used to balance checkbooks on Sunday afternoons. Inside was a financing notice referencing a commercial line of credit secured in part by operating assets stored at my residence. My residence. Not rented warehouse. Not leased commercial unit. My home. There are moments in life when betrayal does not feel hot. It feels hollow, like a floorboard giving way under familiar steps. I called the number on the notice, pretending confusion. The young man who answered spoke too freely, assuming I was already part of the arrangement. He referred to Daniel's growth projections, inventory collateral, shipping volume. Then he mentioned something that made my hand tighten around the phone. As property guarantor, you would have been included in the liability disclosures. Included? I had signed nothing, seen nothing, agreed to nothing. When I hung up, I looked out the kitchen window at the garage and saw not a building, but a trap I had been standing beside in slippers for months. That evening, Daniel came by for pot roast as if life were ordinary. He complimented the carrots, asked whether I had seen the baseball game. I watched him butter a dinner roll with the ease of a man carrying no conscience at all. Then he mentioned casually he might expand into regional distribution by fall. Might need another storage pod in the backyard. I almost laughed at the audacity. Instead, I asked whether his business carried insurance. He froze only for a breath, but mothers notice breaths. Of course, he said too quickly. I nodded and served gravy. I had begun learning silence can be sharper than accusation. The next morning, I drove to see Evelyn Brooks, a retired attorney and old church friend who had known my husband since they were teenagers. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. I laid every paper on her desk. She read without speaking for so long I heard the wall clock click. Then she looked up and said, "Margaret, your son has exposed you to risk he had no legal right to impose." Hearing it spoken aloud changed something in me. It was no longer maternal hurt. It was trespass with paperwork. Evelyn asked if Daniel had access keys beyond the original set. I told her I had seen one on an employee lanyard. Her mouth tightened. She slid a yellow legal pad toward me and began listing steps. Document access. Preserve evidence. Review code enforcement options. Then she said something I would replay all weekend. Reclaim control before he assumes permanent possession.
Permanent possession.
Daniel thought he was scaling a business. I began to see he was rehearsing ownership. Saturday afternoon, I walked through the garage alone while rain tapped the metal roof. At the back wall, behind stacked cartons, I found a steel lockbox bolted beside my husband's old workbench. Daniel had installed it without asking. I touched the cold metal and knew the line had already been crossed. I stood there listening to rainwater drip from the eaves and made a decision so quietly it almost felt like prayer. I was done reacting. I was going to set a trap of my own, and it would begin on a Monday. Sunday evening, I made chicken soup from my mother's old recipe and let it simmer while I spread Evelyn's handwritten notes across the kitchen table. Outside, A freight van pulled into my driveway at nearly 8 o'clock, long after any decent neighbor would have considered business hours over. I stood behind the curtain and watched two men wheel out boxes while Daniel spoke into his phone, pacing as though the property were a loading dock he had purchased. Something about seeing him move so comfortably inside a fiction he had built stirred not anger but clarity. People often imagine betrayal arrives in dramatic moments. Mine came through routines that had become too ordinary to question. The Monday Evelyn and I had spoken of began before sunrise. At 6:15, a locksmith named Frank arrived in a faded blue truck carrying a toolbox that looked older than both of us. He did not ask many questions. Men who have changed locks for decades understand some doors close because they should have closed long ago. We started with the side entry, then the rear service door, then the garage roll-up access keypad Daniel had installed without my consent. New cylinders, new codes, new boundaries. As Frank worked, I walked through the garage one last time before the change became real. My husband's old red tool chest caught the dawn light. Dust floated in the air above stacked cartons waiting for pickups that would not happen. I touched the workbench and whispered, almost to him, I should have done this sooner. By 7:30 the locks were changed. Frank handed me 3 keys on a brass ring and said, "You're secure now, ma'am."
Secure.
The word settled deeper than he knew. But changing locks was never the whole trap. At 8:45 the first employee arrived carrying coffee and froze at the keypad. He punched the old code twice, frowned, then called someone. By 9 2 delivery vans sat idling at the curb while confused workers milled in the driveway. I watched from the kitchen with a stillness I had not felt in months. At 9:10 Daniel's truck pulled in too fast, gravel scattering under his tires. He strode to the side door, rattled the handle, turned, and saw me on the porch. "Mom, what is this?" he asked, half outrage, half disbelief. I stepped down one stair and handed him a sealed envelope. He looked at it as though it might contain an apology. It did not. Inside were copies of a trespass notice drafted by Evelyn, a demand to remove all inventory within 48 hours, and notice that code enforcement had been contacted regarding unauthorized commercial operations. His face changed in stages. Confusion, anger, then something close to fear. He said I was overreacting, said I was jeopardizing his business. I told him quietly he had jeopardized it the day he used my home as collateral without my knowledge. For the first time in weeks, he had no rehearsed answer. Behind him, his employees pretended not to listen. Nothing exposes a man faster than losing authority in front of witnesses. He lowered his voice and asked if we could discuss this privately. I told him we were far past private. Then I pointed to the driveway and said every box leaves by Wednesday.
No exceptions.
He stared at me as if meeting a stranger. In truth, he was meeting the woman I had been before guilt taught me to confuse sacrifice with duty. As he walked back toward his truck clutching the envelope, I noticed something I had not seen in him since childhood. Uncertainty. And I understood power had already shifted before a single box moved. What Daniel did not know yet was that the envelope was only the first layer. The deeper reckoning had already been set in motion. Daniel did not return that afternoon, but the silence he left behind felt temporary, like the stillness before a summer storm. By Tuesday morning, the driveway had become a stage of controlled confusion. Delivery vans arrived, found no access, and left after hurried phone calls. 2 employees came asking whether there had been a security problem. I told them calmly there had been a property correction. The phrase seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. Around noon, Evelyn called to say she had submitted copies of the unauthorized commercial use evidence to county code enforcement. Her voice carried the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who had seen men underestimate paper for 50 years. Then she added something that made me set down my teacup. She had also discovered Daniel had listed my address as principal operating premises in filings attached to a small business tax exemption request. Not only had he occupied my garage, he had sought financial advantage by representing my home as business infrastructure. I looked out the window at the closed garage door and felt no shock left, only confirmation. Mid-afternoon, Daniel arrived with Kelsey beside him, both carrying the brittle politeness people wear when trying to preserve leverage. Kelsey spoke first, saying this had all become embarrassing and neighbors were talking. I nearly smiled at the word embarrassing, as though gossip were the injury and not deception. Daniel proposed moving the inventory within a few weeks. I told him 48 hours remained 48 hours. Then Kelsey made the mistake that ended any softness still lingering in me. She said, "Margaret, you were not really using the space anyway." Not really using the space. My husband had spent 27 years restoring engines in that garage. My grandson had built Pinewood derby cars. At that workbench, I had stored Christmas ornaments there still wrapped in newspaper from 1986. I looked at her and understood entitlement often arrives dressed as practicality. I invited them inside and placed a second envelope on the table. This one held copies of utility overages calculated by Evelyn's office, documentation of potential insurance exposure, and a proposed repayment schedule for unauthorized commercial use. Daniel laughed once, nervously, as if the figures had to be theatrical. Then he stopped laughing. The amount was real. His face drained as he turned pages. For the first time, Kelsey said nothing. Daniel asked whether I would really pursue reimbursement against my own son. I told him I had already spent years subsidizing his ambition without consent. We were simply putting arithmetic where sentiment used to hide. After they left, I expected triumph. What came instead was grief, thin and quiet. Not for the business conflict, but for the slow recognition that a child you raise can learn to confuse access with ownership. That evening I walked into the garage and began opening old cabinets one by one. Beneath rolls of shipping labels, I found my husband's socket set, missing pieces. Under cartons of humidifiers, I found the small wooden tackle box he used on lake trips. Reclaiming a place begins with touching what was displaced. Wednesday morning, county inspectors arrived earlier than expected. Their trucks alone drew curtains twitching up and down the street. One inspector measured commercial shelving while another photographed fire code violations tied to blocked exits and electrical overloads. Daniel arrived during the inspection and tried explaining it was a family arrangement. The inspector asked whether he held commercial occupancy approval. He did not answer. Watching him stand silent before strangers while clipboards moved around him, I realized exposure has its own kind of justice. But the sharpest turn came when one inspector asked who owned the property. Daniel opened his mouth. I answered first. "I do." And in that simple sentence, spoken without raising my voice, I felt something larger than anger settle into place. Ownership.
Authority. Return.
Yet even then Daniel believed this could still be negotiated. He did not know the financial reckoning moving toward him had already left the station. By Thursday, the story had moved beyond family tension into something colder and harder, the world of records, penalties, and consequences that do not bend for excuses. County code enforcement posted formal notices at the side entry and garage door, bright orange sheets fluttering in the wind where Daniel's employees once swiped access cards. One cited unauthorized commercial occupancy. Another referenced safety violations tied to storage density and unpermitted electrical modifications. I watched Daniel read them from the driveway, jaw tight, hands trembling just enough to betray panic. He kept insisting this was temporary, administrative, something a few calls could fix. But systems built on assumptions tend to collapse when the assumptions are exposed. That afternoon, Evelyn called with another discovery. Daniel's business had claimed depreciation on improvements made to property he did not own, including shelving, wiring, and what he had listed as warehouse security installations. The steel lockbox bolted beside my husband's workbench had become an accounting line item. I laughed once when she told me, not because it was funny, but because greed has a way of over-documenting itself. Evelyn said a tax attorney she trusted believed the false claims could trigger a formal review. I sat very still after hanging up. Daniel had not merely taken liberties. He had built risk upon risk, trusting I would never look behind the curtain. Late that afternoon, he knocked on my front door alone.
No Kelsey.
No employees. Just my son looking suddenly older. He asked whether I would call off the inspectors. Said vendors were withholding payments. Said his operating account was frozen, pending compliance review. There was strain in his voice I had not heard since he was a boy hiding a broken window behind his back. For one dangerous second, pity stirred. Then I remembered the forged guarantor notice, the duplicated keys, the phrase "our warehouse." Compassion without boundaries had built this mess. I asked whether he had told me the truth about using my property as collateral. He lowered his eyes. That was answer enough. I handed him a third envelope. This one contained a notice Evelyn had prepared offering settlement terms. Remove all inventory by Saturday. Repay unauthorized utility and occupancy costs over 12 months. Withdraw all filings using my address. Sign acknowledgement relinquishing any claim or access rights. Daniel flipped through the pages in silence. Then he looked up and asked if I would really make him sign something like a stranger. I told him strangers do not usually forge family into liability. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. Boundaries, once spoken aloud, have a strange way of quieting the nervous system. Friday morning, moving trucks arrived, not to expand his operation, but to dismantle it. Workers loaded pallets under the watch of inspectors. Neighbors pretended to water lawns while observing every minute. In a small American suburb, reputations do not explode. They erode in driveways. Around noon, a man in a press shirt approached me near the mailbox and introduced himself as one of Daniel's larger suppliers. He said they had believed the company owned the premises. Then he apologized to me. Apologized. I had not realized how much I needed the deception named by someone outside the family. By sunset, most inventory was gone, leaving dusty outlines on the concrete where stacks had stood for months. But as I swept debris near the back wall, I found something tucked behind the steel lockbox. A folder of loan correspondence including an unsigned draft that proposed securing future expansion against family real estate transfer expectations. My stomach tightened. He had expected eventual ownership. Not hoped. Expected. I brought the folder to Evelyn that evening. She read one line, removed her glasses, and said, "Margaret, this changes the leverage entirely." I asked how. She smiled in that quiet way lawyers smile before delivering a verdict and said, "Because now we stop defending your property and start proving attempted appropriation." And in that moment, I understood the trap I had set for Daniel was no longer simply closing. It was about to lock. Saturday morning, the air smelled of wet leaves and cardboard dust, and for the first time in months, my garage echoed when I walked through it. Empty space has a sound after occupation. It almost startles you. I spent the morning wiping shelves, uncovering old coffee cans filled with bolts my husband once sorted by hand, restoring small pieces of order, while Evelyn reviewed the loan draft I had found behind the lockbox. By noon, she called and asked me to come by her office immediately. There was something in her tone that made me leave the broom leaning against the wall. On her desk lay copies of county filings, business records, and one page she tapped with a red pencil. A memorandum attached to Daniel's financing packet suggested projected transfer of family real estate upon succession event. I asked what succession event meant. Evelyn looked at me over her glasses and said, in plain language, he was signaling lenders he expected this property to pass to him and was leveraging that expectation in expansion discussions. For a long moment, I could only stare at the paper. It was one thing to exploit generosity. It was another to quietly treat my future death as a business assumption. A strange calm came over me then, sharper than anger. Betrayal, once fully illuminated, can become almost simple. Evelyn said we had grounds not only to force withdrawal of every filing using my address, but to challenge representations made to lenders and tax authorities. Then she asked whether I wished to proceed hard or settle quietly. I thought of Daniel calling my home a warehouse. I thought of Kelsey saying I was not really using the space anyway. I said proceed hard. Monday morning, Daniel arrived believing we were meeting to negotiate softer repayment terms. Instead, Evelyn joined us at my dining table, legal pad open, posture straight as a church pew. Sunlight crossed the same table where I had once helped Daniel with algebra homework. Life has a sense of irony. Evelyn slid a document toward him requiring immediate withdrawal of all transfer expectations filed with lenders, acknowledgement of misrepresentation, and structured repayment. Daniel read in silence, until his breathing changed. Then he looked at me and asked whether I was trying to ruin him. I told him no. Ruin began when he built ambition on assumptions about what he had not earned. He said the succession language was routine lender talk. Evelyn responded by producing correspondence from a bank compliance officer requesting explanation of those assumptions. Daniel's hands shook. Kelsey, who had come late and taken a seat near the doorway, went pale reading the numbers tied to potential penalties if the review escalated. What happened next surprised me. Daniel did not explode. He sagged. Pride often collapses more quietly than people expect. He signed the withdrawal acknowledgement. He signed the repayment schedule. Then Evelyn placed one final document before him, amendment papers for a living trust placing the property beyond any presumed inheritance transfer and directing future control to an independent trustee structure. Daniel stared at me as if struck by something invisible. I told him trust, once converted into collateral, must be rebuilt under different architecture. He signed nothing further. He simply pushed back his chair and left. 3 days later, lenders withdrew his expansion line. A trade association suspended his vendor privileges pending review. Word spread in business circles faster than he imagined. A man who had marketed reliability now carried questions attached to his name. Yet what satisfied me most was not his losses. It was what happened Saturday afternoon when I rehung my husband's fishing rods and rolled the old tool chest back beneath the window. A neighbor walking by stopped and said, "Looks like your garage is yours again." I smiled because she had unknowingly named the deeper truth. It was not just a garage. It was authority returned. And still Daniel believed the worst was behind him. He did not yet know county investigators had requested one final meeting about the tax filings. When Evelyn called that evening and said, "Bring every utility bill you can find," I knew the story was not ending. It was tightening. The county office sat in a low brick building beside the courthouse, the kind of place with fluorescent lights that flatten every face and old linoleum that remembers 1,000 uneasy footsteps. Evelyn and I arrived with folders so thick they barely fit beneath my arm. Utility bills, insurance notices, vendor invoices mistakenly shipped to my address. Every scrap of paper that had once seemed ordinary now felt like testimony. The investigator assigned to the tax review was a woman named Carol Mercer with silver hair and a voice so gentle it made what she said land even harder. She walked us through discrepancies in Daniel's filings line by line. Depreciation claims on improvements made to property he did not own. Business expense deductions tied to residential utilities he had never reimbursed. A request for exemption status based partly on representations that his operating facility carried family transfer assurances. She tapped the forms and said, "These patterns suggest intentional benefit derived from inaccurate ownership assumptions." Bureaucratic language can sound bloodless, but I heard the translation clearly. Fraud wrapped in family familiarity. Daniel arrived 20 minutes late, tie crooked, carrying the look of a man who had slept poorly for weeks. He tried confidence first, said everything was misunderstandings common in growing businesses. Carol listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question so simple it emptied the room. "Did your mother authorize any of these ownership representations in writing?" Daniel said nothing. Silence answered for him. By the meeting's end, he agreed to amended filings, back taxes, and compliance penalties large enough to break the expansion he had once boasted about over Sunday pot roast. But the true unraveling came outside. As we stepped into the parking lot, one of his former suppliers approached him near the courthouse steps. I recognized the man from the driveway days earlier. Their conversation was low, urgent. Then the supplier walked away shaking his head. Daniel stood motionless, staring after him. Later I learned 2 major accounts had suspended contracts pending review. Reputation does not usually collapse in one explosion. It leaves in installments. That evening Daniel called. Not to argue. To ask whether I had known it would go this far. I told him consequences often travel farther than entitlement imagines. He asked if I was satisfied. I looked at the restored garage through the kitchen window and said satisfaction had nothing to do with it. This was correction. The next morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox from the lender tied to his expansion proposal. Because transfer assumptions had been withdrawn and collateral statements challenged, The credit line was terminated. Reading it, I did not feel triumph. I felt something almost solemn. A mother does not celebrate a son brought low, but she may refuse to let him drag her down with him. Saturday, I spent hours repainting the back wall of the garage where shelving had scarred the plaster. White paint over old marks. A humble kind of redemption. Halfway through, my grandson Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. 12 years old, baseball cap crooked, all knees and questions. He looked around and said, "Grandma, it looks like Grandpa's place again." Then he asked if we could rebuild the Pinewood Derby track we used to use. I nearly cried at that. Betrayal narrows the world. Restoration widens it again. We spent the afternoon measuring wood scraps while sunlight moved across the concrete. For the first time since this began, the garage sounded like family. Yet just as evening settled, Evelyn called with news that made me sit down on the workbench. County investigators had referred certain filing irregularities for civil recovery review, which meant Daniel might face claims beyond penalties already imposed. Asked whether that could still worsen, Evelyn answered in the quiet tone she used when truth mattered. "Margaret, the financial reckoning is no longer hypothetical. It is coming." I looked at the new lock gleaming on the side door and understood the story had passed beyond reclaiming space. Now it was about whether Daniel would finally face what he had built on borrowed ground. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the hardest confrontation was still ahead. The civil recovery notice arrived on a Tuesday in a government envelope, so plain it looked harmless. Daniel brought it to my house himself, folded and creased from being gripped too tightly. He stood on the porch where he used to leave muddy sneakers as a teenager, but now he looked like a man standing outside a bank after losing a loan. He said the state was seeking recovery tied to improperly claimed tax advantages and questioned whether certain business gains had been derived through false premises disclosures. I read the notice slowly, while he watched my face for mercy. There was a proposed settlement path, but it involved repayment sums far beyond what his struggling company could easily absorb. He asked whether Evelyn could help reduce exposure. I told him she represented my interests, not the architecture of consequences he built himself. He sat in the porch swing my husband installed 20 years earlier and, for the first time, began speaking not as a businessman defending strategy, but as a son admitting fear. He said he had assumed the property would be his someday. Said he thought using it early was practical. That word again. Practical. How often selfishness borrows the language of reason. I asked whether he had ever once considered asking instead of assuming. He looked away. The silence stretched so long I heard wind moving through the maple tree by the driveway. Then I told him something I had not said aloud, even to myself. Inheritance is not an advance against a living person. It is what remains after respect has already been shown. His shoulders dropped. Something in him understood. But reckoning was still moving. 2 days later, Evelyn arranged a final conference with the recovery division. Settlement terms were harsh, but survivable if Daniel accepted public compliance disclosures, vendor restitution obligations, and personal repayment schedules. The alternative was prolonged action that could have broken him entirely. Before signing, Daniel asked for 5 minutes alone with me in the hallway. We stood beside a courthouse window overlooking the town square, where people carried coffee cups and ordinary troubles. He asked whether I had planned all this from the day I changed the locks. I said no. I planned only to protect my home. The rest unfolded because truth tends to keep walking once invited in.
He signed.
With that signature, his expansion dreams collapsed on paper. A year of profits would go to restitution. Vendor standing damaged. Credit impaired. Public record amended. Tangible costs. Real costs. The kind viewers wait for in stories because justice must feel concrete. But what happened next was the deeper payoff. A week later, Daniel called, asking if he could return something. He arrived carrying the brass nameplate my husband once kept over the garage workbench, the one Daniel had removed when he installed commercial shelving. It read Harold Whitmore Workshop. He held it like something sacred recovered from rubble. We mounted it together above the bench.
No speeches. No dramatic apology.
Just screws turning into old wood. Sometimes restoration sounds like that. Yet Daniel's losses did not end with filings. Word of the compliance disclosures spread through regional distributors. A trade group revoked his preferred vendor status. One article in a local business circular mentioned improper premises representations. Quiet public embarrassment. The kind that lingers. Kelsey, I later heard, had taken a job to help cover repayments. They sold a luxury SUV. Downsized plans. Consequences became domestic, not abstract. And still I did not gloat, because by then my victory no longer depended on his downfall. It rested in what I had secured. The trust amendment finalized. The property protected beyond presumption. The garage restored. My grandson using the workbench again on Saturdays. Then came the final turn neither Daniel nor I expected. Evelyn called to say one vendor involved in the original financing had voluntarily waived claims against me and issued a letter acknowledging I had been improperly implicated. Full exoneration. My name cleared in writing. When I held that letter, heavier than it should have felt, I realized something profound. I had not merely defended my house. I had survived an attempted erasure of authority and turned it into legal acknowledgement of ownership. Yet there remained one final conversation between Daniel and me, one I knew would decide whether this ended as punishment alone or as something harder and truer. The final conversation happened on a Sunday after church, the kind of autumn afternoon when light turns golden on the edges of everything. Daniel arrived alone, carrying no papers this time, no notices, no envelopes, no arguments dressed as explanations. Just himself. We sat in the restored garage beneath the brass workshop nameplate, the scent of fresh pine from a project Ethan and I had left unfinished, still hanging in the air. Daniel looked around at the fishing rods rehung on the wall, the old tool chest polished, the workbench cleared of every trace of cartons and scanners. He said the space looked smaller than he remembered. I told him no. It only looked honest again. For a long while neither of us spoke. Then he asked why I had never warned him earlier, before inspectors and penalties and public damage. I told him I had warned him many times, only in the language mothers often use, the language of hesitation, soft boundaries, unanswered discomfort. He had simply learned not to hear it. He nodded as though that truth hurt more than the financial losses. Then he handed me a folder. Inside was proof he had completed the first restitution payments, withdrawn all business filings tied to my address, and voluntarily dissolved the corporation name that had once used my home as operating premises. Whitmore Distribution Services no longer existed. I looked up and saw in his face something unfamiliar these past months. Humility. He said he had come not to ask forgiveness, but to accept whatever relationship remained possible. That was when I gave him the final envelope I had prepared days earlier. He frowned, almost smiled, and said another envelope. I told him some envelopes destroy illusions. Others restore order. Inside were amended trust documents naming an independent trustee, protecting the property beyond presumption, and one additional clause Evelyn had drafted at my request. The garage and workshop would pass one day not to Daniel alone, but into a small family legacy trust for Ethan's education and future use, shielded from any business encumbrance. Daniel read the clause twice. His eyes filled though he looked away. I told him inheritance had not been revoked. It had been matured. It would belong to the next generation as stewardship, not entitlement. He whispered, I understand. And for the first time, I believed he did. Weeks passed. The practical consequences settled into his life with stubborn permanence. His former company remained dissolved. The penalties reshaped his finances. He took consulting work instead of running the empire he once imagined. The local business article mentioning compliance violations lingered online long enough to stain his professional pride. That was part of the price. Kelsey became quieter around me, stripped of the polished certainty she once wore. Even neighbors who had once whispered now nodded with a different kind of respect when I walked by. Not sympathy. Respect. Then came the moment that completed everything. At the spring neighborhood association meeting, the same county inspector who had posted orange notices months earlier approached me in front of half the room and said, Mrs. Whitmore, yours is the cleanest property correction case we have seen in years. Property correction case. I almost laughed. What bureaucrats call correction, storytellers call justice. Daniel was there when she said it. He lowered his eyes, then looked at me and gave a small nod that carried more apology than words could have. That night I locked the garage side door, touched the brass key in my hand, and realized every layer of the payoff had landed. The deception had been exposed in records. The business built on borrowed ground had collapsed. Financial penalties had been paid. Reputation had taken its wound. My legal control stood stronger than before. The family property had been protected beyond manipulation, and the son who once assumed ownership had learned access is not inheritance. I thought changing locks would be my revenge. It was not. It was merely the first boundary. The real victory was larger. I did not just take back a garage. I took back the right to define what could and could not be taken from me. And once a woman reclaims that, no one enters again without permission. Spring settled over the neighborhood with dogwood blossoms along the sidewalks and the kind of warm light that makes old houses seem almost forgiving. By then the worst of the legal fallout had passed, but the deeper consequences were still teaching themselves through ordinary life. Daniel came on Saturdays now, not with delivery schedules or business calls, but with a toolbox and work gloves. We repaired cabinet hinges in the garage, sanded an old oak stool my husband once used at the workbench. Sometimes we spoke. Sometimes the scrape of sandpaper carried the whole conversation. Redemption, I learned, rarely arrives dramatically. It enters through repeated humble acts. Yet even in this quieter season, the story had one more layer to reveal. One afternoon, Evelyn stopped by carrying a slim folder and a pie from the church bake sale. She said she had finalized something she believed I would appreciate. Inside the folder was a formal release from every entity that had ever listed me, my property, or my personal assets in connection with Daniel's former business obligations. Full legal severance. No contingent exposure. No residual claims. My name stood entirely outside the wreckage. I traced my finger over the signature lines and felt a satisfaction too deep for triumph. Clean closure has its own dignity. Evelyn then handed me one final document she had drafted without my asking, a property covenant restricting any future commercial use of the garage without my written consent and trustee approval. She smiled and said, "Sometimes the best revenge is making repetition impossible." I laughed harder than I had in months. The phrase stayed with me. Making repetition impossible. A week later, the neighborhood held its annual spring block gathering. Folding tables lined the cul-de-sac, children ran through sprinklers, and someone grilled hamburgers badly enough to perfume the whole street with smoke. It was there, among paper plates and lawn chairs, that the social balance shifted in a way no courtroom could produce. Mr. Calloway from 2 houses down, who had watched delivery vans crowd my driveway for months without ever saying a word, raised a plastic cup and said loudly enough for half the block to hear, "Margaret taught all of us not to let family turn kindness into a lease." Laughter followed, but so did nods. Even Daniel, standing beside the grill, smiled with a rueful expression that held no resentment. Public shame had once threatened him there. Now public acknowledgement restored something in both of us. Later that evening, Ethan asked if he could paint a sign for the workshop. Together we stenciled new letters beneath Harold Whitmore Workshop. In smaller script below, he painted "Family is Stewardship." I stared at those words while paint dried and thought how strange it was that a child had named the moral grown adults had violated. In the months that followed, Daniel kept every repayment obligation. Never missed one. Rebuilt modestly.
Carefully.
The grandiose ambition that had once occupied my garage was gone, replaced by something more sober. At times I caught him looking at the brass key hanging by the side door, as though remembering the day a lock changed his life. Once he asked if I had ever considered simply forgiving him, without all the legal force. I answered honestly. Forgiveness without correction would have taught you nothing. He nodded and said, "You are right." It was the first time he had said those words to me as a man. Yet the most satisfying payoff came in a small, unnoticed moment. One rainy Tuesday, I found an old invoice tucked in a drawer from the first industrial shelving he had installed. At the bottom in his handwriting were the words "temporary warehouse setup." Temporary. I held that paper and smiled at the irony. What he had called temporary nearly became permanent occupation. What I did in response he once called overreaction. History had judged otherwise. Because now every measure of justice had landed. The deception had been exposed. Financial penalties enforced. Reputation humbled. Legal control strengthened. Family hierarchy corrected. And beyond all that, the woman who once hesitated to challenge her own son had become someone who wrote boundaries in deeds, trusts, and memory. I thought the story was about reclaiming a garage. It was not. It was about teaching a son that access granted in love can be revoked when abused. And before the final chapter closed, there remained one truth I wanted Daniel to hear from me directly. A truth not about property at all, but about what he nearly cost and what, against all odds, had been restored. The truth I wanted Daniel to hear came on a warm June evening as we sat in lawn chairs outside the garage while crickets started their slow chorus in the hedges. I told him there had been a time I believed betrayal inside a family had to be endured quietly because speaking against it felt like tearing your own skin. I was wrong. Silence had nearly cost me my home, my legal standing, and something harder to name, the authority of my own life. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he said something I never expected to hear. He said the day the locks changed was the first day he realized I was not an extension of his plans, but a person he had trespassed against. In another story that might have been enough for an emotional ending. But life had one final reckoning still to deliver, and it came not through private healing but public exposure completed. 2 weeks later, the Regional Small Business Association issued its final disciplinary bulletin from the compliance review. Daniel's former company was formally censured for misrepresentation tied to premises and collateral disclosures, and the censure was published to member vendors. A dry administrative notice to most people. But in the world where he had once traded on credibility, it was a scar visible to everyone who mattered. He called me after receiving it and said quietly, "It is all there in writing now." I answered yes. Truth usually arrives in writing after lies do. The same week, county recovery auditors closed their file with final penalties paid and no residual exposure to me. Full discharge.
Permanent closure.
My name, once improperly entangled in his ambition, stood entirely free. Evelyn brought the stamped closing order to my house in a manila envelope, and we opened a bottle of sparkling cider in the garage beside Harold's old workbench. She lifted her glass and said, "To the woman who turned a lock into precedent." I laughed until tears came, yet even that was not the peak. The peak came on the 4th of July, with neighbors gathered for fireworks and folding chairs spread across the
cul-de-sac.
Mr. Calloway asked Daniel in front of half the block whether he had learned not to build businesses in other people's shadows. Daniel smiled, looked toward me, and answered loud enough for everyone to hear, "I learned my mother owns more than a property. She owns the boundary." There was laughter, then applause, spontaneous and unplanned. In that small suburban street, before people who had watched the delivery vans, the inspectors, the whispers, the unraveling, the truth stood publicly reversed. I was no longer the widow whose garage had been occupied. I was the woman who stopped it, exposed it, and prevailed. Weeks later, Daniel made the last restitution payment ahead of schedule. Sold remaining equipment. Closed every loose thread. The luxury he once displayed was gone. The reputation he once leaned on had been humbled. The legal risks he created had recoiled onto him, not me. Financial consequence. Public consequence. Structural consequence. Every layer of payoff complete. And then, as if life wished to put a seal on the lesson, Ethan won a school woodworking award using a project he built in the restored garage, a cedar tackle box modeled after his grandfather's. At the ceremony, he thanked me for teaching him that family means taking care of what is entrusted to you. I sat there under fluorescent school gym lights and realized the inheritance had already begun, not in property papers, but in values preserved. That night, I walked alone into the garage, touched the brass nameplate, and looked around at what had been fought for. The workbench clear. Fishing rods straight. Tools ordered.
No paillettes. No strangers.
No borrowed empire. Only peace earned. People sometimes imagine revenge is the moment an enemy loses. They are mistaken. The deepest satisfaction comes when what was threatened becomes more secure than before. Daniel once treated my home as staging ground for his rise. In the end, that same act cost him money, status, business standing, and the illusion that a mother's generosity could be converted into entitlement. I, meanwhile, gained stronger legal control, protected the property beyond future manipulation, restored my standing publicly, and reclaimed the moral center of my family. Complete reversal. Complete control. Complete exposure. There was no ambiguity left. The son who presumed ownership signed papers admitting limits. The business built on borrowed ground collapsed under its own misrepresentations. The mother underestimated by everyone changed the locks and changed the outcome. Before turning off the garage light, I slipped the brass key into my pocket and smiled at a thought that had taken a year to ripen. Daniel had once believed he was using my garage for his future. In truth, he was constructing the lesson that would cost him everything he had not earned. I closed the side door, heard the deadbolt settle, and knew with a certainty that felt almost holy, nothing of mine would ever again be taken under the disguise of family.